All right, so we're just going to do a quick jaunt through history one more time, not going all the way into ancient history, but I want to remind you that when we talked about ancient Egypt, disease was associated with bad food moving through the body and what was termed fluxing to different parts of the body and making growths, making infections and things like that. And the treatment was to try to get that bad fluxed material out of the bloodstream by bleeding, enemas, purgatives, massage, things like that. And the Egyptians also had a fairly significant pharmacologic compendium. They used things like beer and turpentine, different balms like myrrh, various plants like juniper berries, as well as crushed gems, salt, animal organs. So pretty much anything you can think of would have been explored for its medicinal properties. Now, some things like alcohol obviously are going to have a little bit of a dazing effect, but by and large, these things weren't going to be truly effective in terms of treatment, but they might give someone a little bit of a placebo effect long enough to get better on their own. One quick thing, the Eye of Horus there has been theorized to be the source for our little symbol for pharmacy. I don't know if that's true, but if you squint, kinda, sure, okay. Now we mentioned Galen, who came up with a lot of different anatomical and physiological concepts and really had some significant ideas about how the body was organized, but he really didn't do much in terms of treatment. He was fairly conservative with treatments at the time. So bloodletting was a major thing that he proposed, because what are you trying to balance? You're trying to balance the humors, and funny enough, blood was the one that they always went to, trying to bleed people to get less blood in the system or to strengthen it or strengthen other humors in comparison to the blood. So bleeding is something that's been around since ancient Roman times, if not before, going back to Egypt. And there have been lots of different ways to do it. So you can see here we've got some pottery from Greece showing us that they're doing some bloodletting there into the pan. There are various lancets, and that is what a lancet is. A lancet is an instrument, usually double-bladed, double-side blade, that was going to have the ability to open up some veins. These horrifying things here are called scarificators. These are actually spring-loaded razors that you'd push up against somebody's forearm and then click the button and cha-ching, they'd come out and lose a few pints that way. And I put that before leeches because it makes leeches look positively civilized in comparison. So leeches would be used to drain blood. And fun thing, leeches have actually had a little bit of a resurgence in terms of they have medical leeches now that they'll use to drain areas of blood, because the leeches have, one, anti-clotting saliva, and they're able to drain the areas fairly well. So if you're trying to get blood or hematomas out of an area, they actually can make use of leeches these days. So sometimes these things cycle back around. Now, in terms of treatment and what's going to be eventually pharmacy, around roughly contemporary with Galen, we had a guy named Pediasius Dioscorides, and he was another Greek physician living in Roman era, Mediterranean world, and he put together a huge compendium of all the different plants and botanicals that could be used to treat people. So basically a big compendium of that, and actually had nice illustrations of it. One problem up until now is people would give the names of plants in their descriptions, but it would be very much something that was local. You wouldn't have maybe a scientific name, because we're quite a long way away from Carl Linnaeus coming up with scientific nomenclature for different organisms. So just because some book said use this herb doesn't mean you actually know what that herb is where you live. It could be called something different. So he made sure to include a lot of pictures, a lot of diagrams, so people actually knew what plant they were looking at. And the name of the book is called De Materia Medica. And even though we call it pharmacology now, up until the 19th century, that class was called Materia Medica. Actually, I kind of like it. Maybe it'll make a comeback too. But Materia Medica has been in print since then. I actually made sure to check before this series of talks. And yeah, you can go buy this book on Amazon as we speak. I don't recommend you study for board exams using it. It's been a little bit superseded since then. All right. So moving into the Middle Ages, and we have followed the Roman Empire over time. A lot of that activity was saved by moving to the Islamic empires, and we talked about some of the big names that were involved in that. In terms of treatment, just a few, Avicenna was probably the biggest name, and his works became very authoritative in Europe and throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So Avicenna was the big name for treatment. He wrote what was called the Canon of Medicine, which remained in use for a long time. And even if people disagreed with Avicenna, they had to address what they disagreed with about him. He was the big name that people had to deal with. Now, the way he grouped his treatments was into simples and compounds, and the name pretty much tells you what to expect. Simples were single substances, whether they be herbs, minerals, etc., and compounds were, combinations of those things. Now, another guy, Rhazes or Al-Razi, had kind of made alchemical research his big area. And when we think about alchemy, what sort of things do we think about today? What do you think of when you hear the word alchemy? Transmuting lead into gold, changing things. Alchemy, what else? Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Yeah, did you guys know that in Britain it was originally Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, but they didn't think that would fly on the American market, so it became the Sorcerer's Stone? There we go. So alchemy really was what set up the ability for people to develop the methods like distillation, mixing, sublimating things, and actually coming up with what would become chemistry. And Rhazes was one of the people who really made a lot of progress with that. He did actually come up with a lot of the tools and techniques for distillation and extraction. I always thought it was really kind of ironic that one of the great Muslim medical scholars is the one who came up with distillation of alcohol. So it wasn't really taken well there, but it spread globally thereafter. But his theory on health was called the mercury-sulfur theory, and it encompassed not just human health, but pretty much everything in the world was a mix of mercury and sulfur. And that's one reason alchemy made sense in the theories at the time, is that if everything is just a mixture of mercury and sulfur, you can change things from one to another by changing the ratio of mercury and sulfur in them. There wasn't really an inkling of the periodic table where you have these relatively stable elements that don't really combine on a deep level under normal circumstances. We know that fission and fusion happen now, but generally the elements that we have are what we have. But at the time, the theory was that you could transmute these things from one to the other, and if people had an imbalance, that adjusting that mercury-sulfur level in their body through the foods they eat could be a way to help treat them with from illnesses. All right, so the goal of treatment, whether it was done through bloodletting, food, simples, compounds, etc., was to return humoral balance. But in medieval Europe and the medieval Middle East, a new consideration came in, and that was that everyone had a different humoral baseline, and that baseline was determined by astrology. So the position of the sun, the moon, the planets at the time of your birth, at the time of your conception, actually set what your baseline was. And so to be effective, you not only had to figure out how someone was unbalanced, you had to figure out what their balance was supposed to be, and it could be radically different from someone standing right next to them. So the idea was, I think we're all aware of what astrology is, but medieval astrology was way different from, I'm a Scorpio, therefore I like certain people but don't like others. Oh my God, it's like they know me. But essentially, it was an idea that if you track the movement of the planets, you could come up with some sort of a reading on the person's personality, their basal health level, their humoral balance, and so on. And to be honest, it's not the stupidest idea on Earth. I mean, what things do follow lunar cycles? We got tides, menstrual cycles, things like that. It wasn't something that was completely erroneous because there are things that have influence on the stages of the moon and so forth. So astrology was widely practiced, and it was largely as a way to kind of forecast people's health so that they could actually intercede with them with different medical treatments. So after the Mongol invasions destroyed Damascus and Baghdad, a lot of scholars who had been working in the Muslim Empire, and I should mention, the scholars were not all Muslim. There were lots of Christians, Jews, and Muslims working as scholars in these empires. And once those cities were destroyed, they fled to Europe, which happened to have developed the university system, and they were ravenous for the texts and the expertise that these people were bringing from there. A lot more direct translations from the Greek of not just medical people like Avicenna and Galen, but more direct translations of Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. Now, the medieval universities were all about status and all about authoritative demonstrable precedent with who thought about what. So once again, what's the most important thing in this picture? What's everybody looking at? The book. So you've got the lecturer, actually professing up atop there, and everyone's following along if they can, and it's to follow along and try to get the most authoritative knowledge they can from Galen, Aristotle, etc. So the high status that these physicians began to get fed into that idea that people who were intellectual workers didn't work with their hands, and fairly soon physicians were distinguished by wearing a long robe to distinguish them from their other colleagues who wore short robes. Does that ring a bell with anybody right now? So when you get that long coat at the end of this, just realize that actually goes back a lot further than you might expect. So what was going on in Europe during the Middle Ages? Well, illness had been kind of conceptualized as an imbalance of the humors, but other things like sin, demonic possession, supernatural judgment on you or your family as a cause of disease were very much in vogue as a way to understand why some people got sick. The physicians, as we said, were affiliated with high status institutions, and they really didn't do much touching of their patients. In fact, they often had a stick that they'd use to kind of prod people and kind of see what they were doing right there. The people who actually did the work of doing the bleeding, gathering the fluids, actually doing treatments, those were people called barbers and surgeons. And a lot of people who are into surgery might be surprised that surgeons were the lowest of the low status people back then. They were considered to be, not really intellectual. They were more manual workers, and they weren't on par with the physicians who wore the long robes. So one thing that physicians could do, and I'm making sure that my children are paying close attention because they'll love this, is they could inspect the urine. So physicians would have a barber gather urine from somebody, maybe pass a catheter if someone's having trouble urinating, and then would gaze longingly into the clear glass to see the color of the urine. And they would literally take it and look at a urine color wheel to figure out what the problem was. So yeah, if your urine is dark green, I don't know, I can't read the color wheel, but I know that's bad. So inspecting the urine was actually a major diagnostic that the people at the time would use. And once again, the theory they were using doesn't correlate with any medical science we know of today, but if you look at urine, there are things you can figure out. You got a UTI, well, that doesn't look right. So we've got bacterial infection in the urine, got muscle proteins that have been broken down, myoglobinuria, or blood in the urine. So it's not that it's an outlandish concept, it's just that it was linked to a physiological model that didn't really help explain what the problem was. So, what happened in Europe? Well, it's impossible to bring up health and medicine in Europe, or even the entire world at that time, the Asiatic and European world, without talking about the bubonic plague or the Black Death. So essentially, at the time it was called the Great Mortality, killed between 1/3 and half of the people in the Middle East and Europe in the mid-13th century. And it's actually one of the first instances of biological warfare. The Mongolian armies were besieging a city on the Black Sea called Kaffa, and plague broke out in their camp. And before they left, because they couldn't maintain the siege, they catapulted plague victims over the walls and infected the people in the town of Kaffa. And some sailors from Genoa sailed back to Italy, brought the plague there. And one interesting thing about the Black Plague is if you look at where it spread overland slowly, but it jumped from port to port as people would travel by sea and start up new loci of infections in different countries in those cities where they came to land. Venice was one of the only places that it was actually able to dodge the worst of it because Venice had an existing quarantine. And quarantine actually translates as 40 days. And they would put them on an island for 40 days. And if you were still alive at the end, great, you get to come into town. So that's how that worked. So the Black Death, spread by rats and fleas, although people didn't know that at the time, jumped all over Europe, and it kind of made a very slow clockwise progression from southern Asia, across Europe, eventually made it to Iceland even, and then back to Russia, eventually kind of making a little bit of a circular path. So the plague, people not knowing that it was spread by, we're talking about Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, didn't know it was spread by fleas and rats. It was blamed on spiritual judgment, divine wrath. Jewish communities were sometimes blamed because sometimes Jewish communities actually escaped the worst of it because they were isolated and they had hygienic practices that kept things a little bit better. One problem that people never seem to figure out is that countries that had no Jewish settlements still had the Black Plague, but no one seemed to care. So this contagion that spread back and forth was blamed on a lot of different things, most of them backing up pre-existing prejudice or not really getting to the root of the problem. Now, one theory was that the Black Death was caused by earthquakes that caused bad air, that miasmatic air, to come out from underground and kill people. Now, once again, this isn't quite as outlandish as it sounds because people who'd been miners knew that occasionally you could find a pocket of quote-unquote air underground and everybody would die because that air was actually trapped carbon dioxide or other gases, and the idea was that, oh, it must be released from the ground and it's just killing people around there as we go. Now, the idea behind the bad air in the earth was also linked to astronomy, or astrology rather, because it was thought that gold, silver, bad air, bad gases were formed by the conjunction of the planets, the sun, and the moon that shone down on part of the earth when it was forming. So it was thought that gold locked down in the earth formed because the sun was shining especially bright on it was forming, but some combination of really negative factors would cause that bad air that would then kill people. So how do you fight bad air? What do you think? Good air. So if you look at the plague doctor mask, the reason it has that beak is because they would put perfumes, flowers, spices, other things in that beak so that they would be inhaling good air. And then up until the 17th, 18th century, a lot of doctors would walk around with staffs or little kind of walking sticks that had a little puffball at the top where they'd put something that smelled good, and they'd actually kind of hold it up to their nose to kind of keep the bad smells at bay, because it's thought you fight bad air with good air. One example of the contrary is slightly hilarious, but really not if you think about it, is one area thought, well, we have to fight the bad air with even worse air. So people in that area would go to the public latrines and like stick their face down in the toilet and like breathe in like as hard as they could to try to fight the bad air. Yeah, I think you and I all agree on exactly how efficacious that was going to be. So the idea was that you would fight the bad air with good air, and that's where the plague doctor's suit actually came in. But they actually wound up, using boiled leather, oiled it up, had gloves on, they'd use sticks, and inadvertently came up with what I like to think of as a medieval hazmat suit. So these suits actually worked reasonably well to keep the doctors safe. Now, obviously, if a flea gets through, bites the person, they can still die, but it makes it a lot harder for that flea to get in and bite the person. You should know, though, that the classic plague doctor look didn't come around until the 17th century. So there were precursors to it in the Middle Ages, but nothing that quite looked quite as cool as that. So another treatment that was present during the medieval era was actually something that you might not expect, and it was magic. Magic was considered to just be a study of natural phenomenon, and it was thought that magic, existed because God had put certain correspondences into the world that you could harness to have an effect, and part of the way you could do that was through health. So part of this idea was that there were sympathies between things, and if you could kind of work with those, you could figure out a way to treat someone based on their affliction, the cause of their affliction, and finding something that was similar to it. All right, so hope you guys are ready. Again, this won't be on Comlex, but it's time for magical case studies. All right, I've done my best to phrase these in a board-relevant style. So, a 46-year-old knight is constantly feverish and phlegmatic, producing copious nasal discharge. His imbalance is brought about by an excess of phlegm weakening his brain. What dietary intervention might the doctrine of signatures suggest? So how do we strengthen this guy's brain? What do you think? More brain. Okay, that's a possibility. You'll go with that one. You could feed them brains. Raw meat? Maybe.
The disease is wet, so he should eat dry food.
Wet, he should eat dry food. That's very good. That's not the doctrine of signatures. That's more straight humoral theory, but that's good. But may I suggest we eat something that maybe isn't a brain, but kind of looks like a brain? Oh, man. Walnuts look like a brain. There must be some correlation there. Therefore, we're going to have this guy eat some walnuts. All right, next case study. Venetian merchant has a naturally cold disposition and needs to eat more warming foods. However, the Ottoman Empire has blockaded Constantinople and throttled the supply of spices and other innately hot foods. What other sort of food might be advantageous for this person? So we can't get like spicy hot foods that readily now. So what else could we give this person to help with his naturally cold disposition? Hot water. Okay, not bad, not bad. I want you to think a few steps further down though, like what's hot? What kind of things can we do with that? What's that? Tea hadn't made it to Europe yet, I'm so sorry. Stew. All right, well, let me ask you guys this. What's the hottest thing there is? Fire. What's up in the sky that's even hotter than fire? The sun. Why don't we feed him some sunflower seeds? So these are the sort of things people would be doing to try to come up with interventions based around that theory of signatures. Okay, I'm putting a prompt up here. What sword balm? Thank you for asking me about sword balm. Okay. So, doctrine of signatures could also be used to treat traumatic injuries, although I think you'll agree not very well. So, if somebody was cut by a sword or a dagger, occasionally they would say, oh, we have to help them. So we're going to take some balm, we're going to take something that soothes and makes it work, makes it nicer, soothes the injury, and we're going to not put it on the person, we're going to wipe it on the blade of the sword that hurt them. Because it was thought that there were little invisible connections still between the weapon and the injury that it caused. And by coddling the weapon, we would help heal the wound that it had caused. So yeah, if you ever travel through time, don't go to the medieval ER. Just don't. Oh, speaking of which, I don't have time to show it, but if you go online, there's an old Saturday Night Live sketch starring Steve Martin called Theodoric of York, Medieval Barber. It's hilarious, so go ahead and check that out. So, how about some names? Moving into medieval, moving into Renaissance, we have a few people who really started to make a shift in how treatments were thought of. And the first one, really kind of a bigger than life person, is named Paracelsus. His actual name, full name there, is Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus von Bastus von Hohenheim. Obviously German, actually Swiss, but coming from middle part of Europe. And he's considered the father of toxicology. He's the person who basically came up with the idea that it's not the poison that makes the poison, it's the dose that makes the poison. And something that can be poisonous in one concentration can be therapeutic in another. So he studied a lot of different things: astrology, alchemy, medicine, metallurgy, especially mining and metallurgy. He was one of these people who broke that idea that intellectuals didn't get their hands dirty. He was very interested in geology and metallurgy. And his theory of how everything was put together added a third element to that mercury-sulfur theory. It was salt. So salt plus sulfur plus mercury was the mixture that could permute and make anything. He related different plants to diseases, and again, as I mentioned, he's the one who came up with the idea that it's the dose that makes the poison. So he broke with tradition not by lecturing in Latin, but in the vernacular of where he was at in German. And he would actually open up his lectures by burning copies of Galen and Avicenna, basically saying that, yeah, this is crap, we're not going to worry about what the authorities say, we're going to go with what can actually be shown. So he had a very experimental approach and really did some interesting observations. He did, however, in his personal life was just as contentious as his professional life, and he was basically bounced from town to town after getting into various legal problems, alienating people at all the universities where he was associated. And my favorite tidbit about him is that it's rumored that all of the works of his that we have are just transcriptions that his students took down while he was rambling in various taverns and so forth. So, got some names there. The ability to kind of control the supply of simple pharmacologic treatments became more important. And actually some universities, starting with Padua in Italy, grew their own gardens. These are called physics, which is one place where the word physician comes from, but they would have these botanical gardens so they could actually collect and have a ready supply of different simple botanical items that they could then mix into various compounds, various complexes, and excuse me, and so forth. And this one's actually still there. I've not been to Padua, which sucks because that's where Vesalius did most of his work, but someday I'll make it there. And this garden is still present, so you can actually go still tour this botanical garden at the University of Padua. So in terms of taking botanicals and actually getting modern drugs out of them, one of the first steps that happened there was a process known as pharmacognosy. And despite the long-sounding word, it's just basically getting pharmaceutical treatments from existing botanical or other sources. So William Withering experimented with foxglove. And if you look at the name foxglove, Digitalis purpura, that's a drug, Digitalis. Basically, foxglove is poisonous, but as Paracelsus said, it's not necessarily the thing that's the poison, it can be the dose of the thing. And various kind of wise women and other folk healers had been using foxglove for a while to treat what was called dropsy, or heart failure. So people would get waterlogged, they'd have the inability to pump fluid through their heart and their body effectively. But the foxglove, Digitalis, would actually help them get rid of some of that water. The problem is, not all of these flowers are equally potent. So you might prescribe something to a person and they die. Or you might prescribe it to them and it's not effective because it's not at a therapeutic dose. So he actually started work on trying to actually standardize how it was given and keep track of what the dosage was and actually see if it worked for people. So this is actually how we got digoxin and Digitalis. And people started looking at controlling how these pharmacologic treatments were delivered, and that's the process that began looking at what things actually worked and had a therapeutic effect and which ones didn't. Now we're going to jump pretty radically to a different thing because about the same time, different theories had taken hold in the natural sciences that there were imponderable fluids that were just everywhere. There were things that we couldn't quite comprehend that were around. If you think about gravity, it's not really something we think of as a fluid, but it's something that's acting at a distance and we can't see it, but yet it has real effects. And during the Enlightenment, people went nuts with various types of fluids that they used to explain various phenomenon. My favorite is phlogiston. Anybody ever heard of phlogiston? All right, phlogiston was the theoretical fluid that allowed things to burn. So if I had a log, that thing was just saturated with phlogiston. You throw it on the fire, it turns to ash, it has been deflagellated. So ash has had all of its phlogiston removed, that's why it burned. So it was a theoretical fluid that allowed things to burn. Another one was animal electricity. Galvani noticed that if he actually used an electric spark on frogs' legs that had been removed from the frog's body, it could actually cause them to jerk. So he thought, well, there's this animal electricity because the electricity we're experimenting with has that effect. Volta came along and actually realized that that animal electricity could be explained through chemistry. You could use zinc and copper to get a similar reaction, and that animal electricity and chemistry were actually connected. Now, arguably the most important one was electrical fire. Electrical fire, discovered by Benjamin Franklin, who we think of as the founding father, but everywhere else in the world is known as a scientist of the Enlightenment era. So Benjamin Franklin, for us, one of the founding fathers, but everywhere else he was more renowned as a inventor, scientist, and so forth. And he came up with the idea that electricity, lightning were all the same, and he invented things like the lightning rod that allowed houses and churches to stop being burned down all the time because it gave a way for the electricity to ground without going through the flammable or explosive parts of houses or other buildings. Now, I don't know if there were quite this many cherubs present at the actual event. And if we're going to go full fantasy, I prefer to think of it like this. Or Ben Franklin duels Zeus for the power of electricity. Now this is great for lots of reasons, but the Wolverine claws that Franklin has really sends it over the top for me. All right, so electrical fire was one of these imponderable fluids, and it's now basically the entire basis for our society. It's basically electricity and all the things that have come from that since then. And the last one I want to mention is called animal magnetism. And the person who came up with this was a Viennese, we call him a psychiatrist now, but a physician named Franz Anton Mesmer. So if you didn't realize, Mesmer, as in mesmerize, is called that because of this guy. That wasn't a term before him. He came up with mesmerization. And his idea was that animal magnetism flowed through the whole universe, but also flowed through people and animals, and blockages in the body would cause nervous diseases, would cause various neuroses or anxieties, and his treatments actually seemed to work. He actually treated a lot of high-strung people in Viennese society and seemed to cure their illness. In what we would consider it to be now, he used kind of post-hypnotic suggestion, psychoanalysis, things like that to get the process going. But he insisted that his results were due to animal magnetism. And even though he had good results, he was absolutely insistent that his theory had to be adopted in addition to his results. And it didn't help that his theory was, contradictory, didn't really make a lot of sense, and he would revise it and change it and kind of contradict earlier versions of it. So the good that could have been done by adopting his results and coming up with different experimental and explanatory methods was dropped because he insisted on it. And these kind of procedures fell into disuse until much later when Sigmund Freud would adopt some of the ideas for psychotherapy. And the ideas of unblocking areas that had been kind of stymied or become stagnant was actually something that A.T. Still investigated, but in more of an anatomical process of looking at how you could unblock fluid areas that had been kind of made stagnant, or move lymph, and so forth and so on. So one fun thing about Mesmer is that he was investigated by the French government because they wanted to know if there was actually anything going on with his processes, and they assembled a panel of scientists to judge whether Mesmer was actually competent at doing this. And the scientists who were present had different studies they do, and they would blindfold the patients, and it was basically shown that it was all placebo and suggestion, and there wasn't really anything behind it. And one of the scientists who was on that panel, surprise, was Benjamin Franklin, who was in France representing the US during the Revolutionary War period. And this is a kid's book that as soon as I saw this, I had to buy it. So there we go. There's a kid's book about the process of Ben Franklin discrediting Franz Anton Mesmer. So Christmas is coming up, add that to your list. So, looking at how disease developed, we also had to come up with ways to assess the health of patients, and physical examination skills were something that the French were really kind of key to. So the physical exam became more systematic and was pioneered by French physicians, starting with a guy named Jean-Nicolas Covassar, and he also is the person who came up with grand rounds. So you can either thank him or curse him for coming up with that. But auscultation and percussion were popularized by him because we had a lot of people suffering from tuberculosis. Now, back then, they didn't call it TB. What did they call tuberculosis then? Consumption. And what area of the body do we associate with tuberculosis more often than not? The lungs. It affects other places too, but it affects the lungs. And so Covassar had actually grown up as the son of an innkeeper, and he remembered that his dad would check to see if there was enough beer in the casks by tapping on it, percussing it, see what level it was at. And he thought, well, maybe I can figure out where the fluid levels are, where the dull resonant spots are in people's chests doing the same thing. So that's what Covassar came up with. But arguably, a better and more lasting contribution was made by one of his students, a guy with another great name, René Théophile Hyacinthe Laennec. And his name is very flowery, and he was actually a very delicate kind of person as well. He was a student of Covassar's, and during one of the grand round sessions, it was his job to take and listen to the heartbeat of one of the patients. Now, this is the summer in Paris, pre-air conditioning, pre-good sewers, and he was being asked to take listen to the heartbeat of what was described as a very sweaty and overweight prostitute who was there for heart failure. And he was a very shy, demure person, and at the time, the only way to do this was to stick your ear up against the chest. And one description of it is that he literally fled the room in, kind of like horror at this. But while he was kind of recovering from that shock, he realized, well, wait a second, when we were kids, we would roll up newspaper and stick it to something. We could actually hear someone tapping or scraping. So he came back into the room with a rolled up piece of paper and used that, and actually found out that it worked better than direct application of his ear. Now, being an amateur woodworker, he started actually building the original stethoscopes by turning them on a lathe, and they were wooden. And if you eventually bought the book that he wrote about how to use it, he would actually send you a wooden stethoscope that he turned himself on his lathe. And this rigid stethoscope made out of wood is now the universal symbol for, hello, I'm a doctor. So not too bad. So the stethoscopes became more and more powerful as technology improved, and Laennec tragically died of tuberculosis, which after the invention of the stethoscope, he did a lot to diagnose and come up with the progression of the disease as well. So he did a lot with pulmonary disease, but eventually succumbed to one himself. Now, one thing we haven't talked a lot about is microbiology. We've mentioned it a little bit in the last talk, but microbiology, or the study of pathologic organisms, has been around throughout human history, but it's not been phrased in quite that way. People didn't always know that there were little tiny living organisms that could cause illness, infest food, be spread from person to person. And one of the earliest diseases that we have evidence of is smallpox. Now, smallpox, we can find evidence of it in burials throughout the world, roughly fatal 30 to 40% of the time. So it's a really devastating disease. Now, what happens with smallpox is people develop these pustules all over their body that they can actually converge, slough off a lot of skin, and be fatal. And even if people survive, there's often significant scarring, sometimes blindness if their eyes were involved. But the idea of variolation actually came from China originally, and that's that you take the crust of some of these pustules from somebody who's already gotten through the disease, and you kind of scrape it, and then kind of scrape it onto someone else's skin, and it would induce a mild form of the disease, but afterward the person would be immune. Now there's a problem with variolation. What do you think that is? Some people got a full-blown case and died, so it was risky. Now these crusts would be enough to usually cause an infection, but it was often mild, so it was considered fairly safe, but again, it could be fatal, and so it was a bit risky. Now, variolation spread, this is really interesting, it spread from China, not to Europe, but to Africa. And it actually didn't get to Europe and America until African slaves had actually brought it to the people's attention in the Americas. So there was a slave named, his slave name was Onesimus, we don't know his actual name, but he was enslaved by Cotton Mather, the same guy behind the Salem witch trials, but he basically explained how this variolation worked, and Cotton Mather included, kind of encouraged people to have that done, and it actually kind of helped tamp down an outbreak of smallpox in Boston. Now, this was considered to be really risky, and a lot of people, I think actually a bomb was thrown through Cotton Mather's window because people thought this was just a terrible, terrible idea. But he got enough people to buy in that the outbreak of smallpox that occurred was much lower than it would have been expected otherwise. So that idea of variolation eventually spread into Europe and to America, but through a rather more roundabout method. And one interesting thing about the Revolutionary War is that Washington mandated the variolation for the Revolutionary Army, and one reason that the U.S. was able to persist long enough through that war is because we didn't lose so many people to smallpox in the process. So that was actually considered to be one of the reasons the U.S. was able to outlast the British in the Revolutionary War. Now, variolation is dangerous. However, vaccination, come up with, originally described by Edward Jenner, was much safer. And what happened here is that, once again, he was a physician. He'd actually trained under some really impressive people, and then went to become a country physician in England. And he kind of was clued in that there was an old kind of old wives' tale or an old theory that milkmaids never got smallpox because milkmaids always got cowpox. And cowpox is not known at the time, but cowpox is a related disease to smallpox, but it's much, much more mild, produces much milder symptoms, yet it has the same antigens as some of smallpox, and so people would be immune. Now, Jenner didn't dismiss this. He actually started seeing if this could be the case, and he actually vaccinated an 8-year-old boy with cowpox, and this 8-year-old boy was later going to get the variolation, have the actual smallpox crust put in, and it was found that he didn't really have much of a reaction to the variolation, the actual smallpox, because he'd already been vaccinated with the cowpox. And Jenner knew a good idea when he saw it, and he started to recommend people get the cowpox treatment so that they would not get smallpox. So he published his findings very quickly, refused to try to patent it to get a lot of money, which he would have, because he really wanted this to be something that could help people. Now, vaccine hysteria is nothing new. So here's a nice little picture from the area when it's thought like, oh no, you're gonna get these cowpox treatments? Well, guess what? Cows are gonna start growing out of your face, and you're gonna have cows coming out of your armpits and all this other stuff. So essentially, vaccination has been seen, the idea that you're introducing something foreign to the body to help protect it really rankles something very deep in the human psyche, and it's tough to convince people that that is such a good idea. And that's been a constant problem with vaccination since its inception. However, vaccination is one of the greatest public health accomplishments in human history. Fight me if you want. So, we mentioned Louis Pasteur last time as somebody who put together germ theory and basically disproved spontaneous generation, showed that there were, in fact, tiny little things that could cause disease or could cause things to rot. And he used that knowledge along with his microscopic skills to save the French wine and beer industries, save the silk industry. And if that weren't enough, he actually started work on treatment of rabies. Now, rabies is an invariably fatal disease. I think in the literature there is a single case study of someone who has spontaneously recovered from rabies. In all of human history, a single reported case study. Not only is it a nasty, fatal disease, it kills in a really awful way. It was actually used to be known as hydrophobia because the virus causes people to hate water. They don't want to take a drink. Their saliva, which has concentrated amounts of the virus in it, becomes frothy, very easy to spread. And what do people and other animals with rabies kind of have an overwhelming drive to do to other animals and people? Bite them. So it's a way that that virus can actually spread by manifesting changes in behavior of its hosts. So Pasteur was able to actually work through gathering rabies virus. He didn't know it was virus, but he gathered the fluid coming from rabid dogs and was able to kind of pass it down and weaken it, and eventually found a way to treat rabies once it had taken hold. So he was actually able to weaken the virus to the point where he could inject it and it could treat someone. And actually, I think it was an 8-year-old boy was his first patient, and it happened before he was really ready, but this 8-year-old was defending his brother and some other kids from a rabid dog and got bit very badly. And so it was known he was going to die of rabies. So Pasteur gave him a series of injections of this weakened virus, and the kid actually survived and became later a guard at the Pasteur Institute. So the importance of this is, it isn't just a treatment, it's the first time that an actually invariably fatal disease was treated. We actually had a way to pull somebody back from the brink once they'd acquired that disease. So let's give it up for Louis Pasteur. We've got rabies, beer and wine, sorry MSA people, and silk. So let's give it up for Louis Pasteur, maybe the best person ever. All right, now, we kind of danced around the idea that the pharmacology at the time was terrible, but it was. Things really had not changed tremendously from ancient Egypt. We had a whole collection of things that had been categorized differently, moved differently, explored differently, but most pharmacology was just garbage. And in fact, one of the most famous quotes about this was by a very famous physician and anatomist called Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. He was actually the father of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice. But his quote is one of the classic ones that I firmly believe that if the whole of materia medica as now used could be sunk to the bottom of the sea, it would be better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes. So people knew that it wasn't good, but they didn't have anything else to fall back on. This was until we started to get organic chemistry coming along in the early 1800s. And Friedrich Wöhler made an instrumental contribution to this by synthesizing urea. Now, at the time, there was a big split in biology and other natural philosophy subjects between vitalists and materialists. Basically, vitalists said that living organisms and living material was fundamentally different from non-living material. And by synthesizing an organic compound, urea, from non-organic constituents, Wöhler actually showed, nope, it is all the same. The chemistry that makes up life is the same as the chemistry of other things, and we can maybe come up with ways to deal with it that way. More experiments done on different venoms and toxins started to show that you could have demonstrable effects on the human physiology. So curare was given to patients by Claude Bernard, and he was able to show that it didn't just kind of maybe affect them, it definitely shut down the musculoskeletal or neuromuscular junction. It actually had an effect. And this is part of the spirit of that time where people started to experiment scientifically and look at what the effects were, measuring heart rate, measuring outcomes to see what different dosages could do. And this is finally where we actually get pharmacology coming from. Now, considered to be the founder of pharmacology is Oswald Schmeidberg, and he was basically able to show that muscarine evoked the same effect on the heart as electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve. So muscarine, a chemical, could have a similar effect to direct stimulation of a nerve, causing the heart. What do you think? Stimulation of the vagus nerve, what's it do to the heart? Oh, you guys have been paying attention. Good job. Slows it down. Muscarinic receptors obviously would be the similar effect. So showing that these chemicals could actually have the same physiologic effect as other experiments really started pharmacology strong. And finally, we have an American in here as well who trained under Schmiedberg, a guy named John Jacob Abel, found a whole laundry list of things. He extracted epinephrine from the first time and showed that it had effects on the heart rate, muscles, isolated histamine, insulin, and so forth. And he's actually the founder of ASPET, which is still an organization that's going on today. Dr. Newman kind of pulled up their webpage for me. So yeah, ASPET is still the go-to American Pharmacology Society founded by John Jacob Abel. Now, we're isolating different structures from toxins, from plants, and so forth. And one of the things that people were able to isolate early on and investigate for its medical properties was cocaine. Now, cocaine was isolated from the coca plant, and several people had experimented with it, but the first person who found a really, really useful kind of application for it was a guy named Carl Kohler. And he found that a liquid preparation of cocaine could actually numb the eye. It actually numbed the peripheral nerves, and they could therefore do eye surgery much more effectively. Now, I had to double check this. It didn't mean that they could do eye surgery finally, it meant they could do it more effectively. So some way, somehow, they were doing cataract and other operations with no anesthesia. And you can tie someone's arms down, but how on earth do you do eye surgery on somebody when there's no anesthesia? I mean, it's really hard to control your eyes when something's prodding at them. But ophthalmologists realized, wow, we can numb the eye and actually do stuff and people aren't trying to squirm away. This is great. So he was put on this path by a colleague who was investigating every possible use for cocaine he could find, but somehow overlooked this one, and that'd be Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud was banging his head against the table, trying to find ways to use cocaine, mentioned to Kohler, oh yeah, you could probably use it to numb the eye, and then Kohler got famous and Sigmund Freud was incredibly upset. Actually, Coca-Cola, the drink, existed at this point, so Freud constantly called Carl Kohler thereafter Coca-Cola as his little nickname. Now, in terms of other sources for isolating things, one of the most unique ones was penicillin. So in 1928, Alexander Fleming was actually, had one of the best serendipitous discoveries of all time. He was working with cultures of staph, and he was in a relatively dusty and not particularly well kind of ventilated lab, and there would be kind of condensation or other things that would fall onto the plate and cause contamination. And so he noticed that sometimes when he took these plates, there would actually be a little area where all the bacteria had been killed, and it was because Penicillium rubens had actually fallen on there, and that yeast had actually caused death of those bacteria. Now, initially, he didn't think that that really meant much because he thought, well, there's no way that's actually going to work in a body, and he kind of shelved it. But he picked it back up later, about 3 years, and started investigating that penicillin substance that was released and was able to actually come up with ways to treat it. Initially, it was really hard to concentrate it and come up with ways to deal with it, but they did eventually get enough that they could do some treatments, and 4 to 5 infants who had a gonococcal infection of the eye during birth were cured during treatment. So they figured this stuff actually worked pretty well. And on the eve of World War II, there was a nightclub fire in Boston, and the authorities were able to use penicillin to treat people who'd been burned, and it prevented a lot of the infections that would have otherwise occurred from developing, and the people survived. So the US government, entering World War II, knew that they needed this. So they stockpiled it, were able to come up with ways to do it, and thanks to a woman at MIT named Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau, she actually came up with a way to mass produce penicillin so that we were able to have a lot of the soldiers on the Allied side survive the D-Day invasions and pull back from the inevitable infections that happened thereafter. So 12 to 15% of the Allied soldiers treated for wounds and amputations probably made it when they wouldn't have. So let's give it up for Margaret Rousseau. Should also mention that the Axis had pretty much isolated all the stores of natural rubber, and so she came up with a way to make synthetic rubber, which was important for coming up with tires, wheels, and things like that. All right. Now, jumping back to other things that have been around for years, polio is a disease that's existed throughout human history. You can see evidence of it on this Egyptian drawing here, where we've got the wasted leg caused by the viral infection affecting the spine. You can see areas of the world. Polio still exists. It's still around. But there are treatments for it based around weakened viruses. So again, building off of what Jenner did with the cowpox and smallpox, we're coming up with ways to weaken viruses. Now at this point we did know that viruses existed. Initially, viruses were a real mystery to people because they could isolate bacteria and see it under the microscope, but viruses were too small to see, and they figured out that they could filter all the bacteria out of a solution, and yet sometimes infectious material would still be there. Because the viruses are so small, they could pass through the pores of a filter that bacteria could not. And it really wasn't until electron microscopy came along that people were actually able to see evidence physically of a virus, although evidence of it clinically existed all around us. So in terms of polio, Jonas Salk figured out that you could weaken the virus by exposing it to formaldehyde or formalin. It would inactivate or kill the virus, but leave its antigens available for the body to react to. And so those antigens, or those epitopes, would be something the body could form immune complexes against, and you could then inoculate people for polio. And a similar method has been used ever since to come up with different vaccines for different viruses. Now, we're jumping around a lot. We're just going in chronological order now. A really weird one is CPR. CPR didn't exist until the late 50s, early 60s. Prior to that, direct cardiac massage was how you treated somebody who went into sudden heart failure, their heart started going into kind of in spasm and so forth. Anyone want to tell me what direct cardiac massage is? Well, go for it.
It's where you crack open their chest and you actually hold their entire heart and massage it to get the blood pumping.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, there's a...
it's still practiced today.
You can still do it. But basically, the idea, Sherman Newland is a medical historian and surgeon. I think he's passed away, but he was at Yale. And he described when he came up through the ranks in surgery that this was still standard practice. And he said that he had a patient code and he had to go in with a big knife, had to rip open the sternum, plunge his hands in and start squeezing the heart. And he said after a minute, he became cognizant that somebody in the room was screaming. Then he was like, oh, it's me. Like he didn't even realize that he was just screaming in terror because he was a third-year med student having to rip open a guy's chest and massage the heart directly. So CPR, a little bit brutal. It can crack the sternum, crack the ribs, but less so than that. The person who came up with this is an Austrian physician named Peter Safar, and he was able to actually figure out that you could, one, do that massage of the heart through the sternum and have it pump, and you can also exhale air from the lungs with enough O2 to keep a person alive. Now, I have no idea how he got this. This would not pass an IRB exam today, but what he did to prove this could happen is he gave 31 volunteers curare so that he paralyzed their diaphragm and then did CPR on them to keep them alive. I don't know how hard up you have to be for money to volunteer for that, but he was able to get that to work. He's also the person who came up with CPR, the ABC method, and with a Norwegian toy company, came up with Recessa Annie. So all those dummies that we breathe into when we're taking lifeguard training and so forth, that was his idea. Now, he's a really interesting person. He actually also invented the first ICU area, and in Pittsburgh created the first modern EMS system. And this was actually kind of tragically inspired when his daughter died of an acute asthma attack, and he thought, if we'd been able to get her to a hospital sooner, she would have survived. So he actually was the person who kind of came up with the first EMS service that served as a model for other EMS services throughout the country and then the world. Now, following World War II, we have another just absolutely bizarre connection between one area of life and another. And basically, a Scottish physician, Ian Donald, had the idea that, we've been using sonar to detect submarines and other things underwater. I wonder what would happen if we pointed it at a person. So he took sonar, now ultrasound, and actually developed a way to use it to examine people, and that's how he came up with ultrasound. And the first big success was basically a woman who had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and was told, well, you're just going to die, there's not much we can do about it. He used the ultrasound to show it was not actually cancer, it was an ovarian cyst. Now that cyst, had it ruptured, would have killed her, but because it was a cyst, they could go in, remove it, and she survived, and that basically became the first early success story for ultrasound or sonography. And in 1959, first was used for one of its most popular applications now, which is looking at the head of a fetus in utero to kind of track fetal health. So if I could encourage you to be any sort of person, it'd be the sort of person who thinks, looking at boats underwater is cool, but what if we looked inside a person at the same time? So taking one thing from one area of life and finding another application, I think that's where a lot of real jumps in diagnostics and treatment can come from. Last but not least, targeted drug design has now become a big area of pharmacology. And instead of looking for pharmacologic treatments that are naturally occurring, which we still do, getting botanicals, getting venoms, isolating them, trying to see what therapeutic activity they can have, a guy named James Black decided, if stress from epinephrine latching onto beta receptors causes the heart to speed up, maybe we could come up with something that's competitively binds to that same receptor that would not allow the epinephrine to do it, and therefore would stop people from having their heart speed up. And so this was the first designed drug, not a drug that was discovered or isolated. It was actually designed. He thought, well, we've got epinephrine. We'll come up with something that has the same binding properties, but actually binds to that beta receptor and doesn't let the epinephrine do it. And that's how we got the first beta blocker, propranolol. I always have trouble with that word, propranolol. So that was the first time someone actually said, let's take the chemistry that we've learned and design a drug from scratch to have a specific effect, which is now a major area of research. Now, he was a very private person, and I love that he was, quote unquote, horrified to learn that he'd won the Nobel Prize in 1988. So we've jumped around a lot of different things because therapeutics have come from a lot of different sources. There's a lot of different threads to follow, both microbiological, pharmacological, technological, and so forth. So that's pretty much the end of this talk. Next time we're going to jump back in time and do a 2-hour talk on the history of surgery. And it's a lot of fun. That will happen in the new year. So everybody have a great holiday, great break. Good luck on your exams between now and then. Ooh.